Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are close to the bottom of page 1359. And we're learning about Malchus. Malchus as being the ultimate Eir HaMakabel, in the words of Ayin Beis, the energy of a recipient. A recipient shouldn't be understood in a passive way. It is very much a very deliberate and a very critical role of knowing how to absorb and receive properly. So Malchus, in the language of the words of the Arizal, was netzal. It emanated like a nekuda. All the other spheres emanated as a full entity. The Moichin, the Gimel Rishonis of Chabad, they emanated as a structure of 10 spheres within Chochmah, Chochmah within Chochmah, Bina within Chochmah, Das within Chochmah, all the way through Malchus within Chochmah. The six emotions from Chesed through Yesod, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, emanated 6 facets, meaning Chesed Shebe Chesed, Gvura Shebe Chesed, and so on. The truth is, there's also Malchus in there, like we learned, but the Malchus is part of the 6. And therefore, it's still a state of mashpia, hashpah. So though it also has an element of receiving, like we learned yesterday, because the higher parts of midas, the moichin within midas, what he called moichin the yanika, even when the midas are not fully developed, they still, the moichin are reaching upward and receiving from above, but the midas themselves are already capable of transmitting. Malchus, on the other hand, is the only one that emanate as a nekuda, which is he called it the nekudas of Keser within Malchus. And then comes the add-on of the 9 spheres that are added into it. Whereas in Zah, the add-on is the Gimel Rishonis, the Moichin not Yanika, higher levels of Moichin that come. Actually, he said 2 types of moichin. One that comes naturally, and one that comes through avodah. The bottom of page 1357, and it goes the Gimel Rishonos. They already have all 10 spheres, all in their essential structure at the root. So when we talk about Malchus, that's the nekuda of Malchus. We also learned that in each of the spheres there's also a Malchus, but that Malchus is still connected, has some form of hashpah, like he said. But Nechudas HaMalchus that we're discussing is either the Torah Lemivla, but it's busy absorbing, it doesn't have the capacity to exude and be mashpia. That's where we stopped at the end of the parentheses, around 2/3 of the way down the page, 1359. The parentheses, I should also add, just a few more points that he added was that that Zoh has different stages, the midas. There's a stage where they're in a state of katnus, like a child, but even there, it's not a baby, it's a child, so it still has ashpah, it's just not a full, mature ashpah. And he said it's like the kruv, which is a small face of a child, Nar Yisrael Zuta, which is called Yisrael Zuta compared to Abba Ve'ima, right? And he also pointed out that there are different ashpahs that can come. One is she'era, which is like food and sustenance. That's like zah, for the necessity for the world, what is necessary for the sustenance of existence. And then there's ksusa v'enosa. He doesn't explain what those are, but clearly there are higher levels of ashpah. But even the lower level is also ashpah. It's also a transmission which comes from the yichud of zun, yichud chitzeni of Abba Ve'ima, katnus. Okay, bottom line is that Zoh has an element of transmitting, even though it also has an element of absorbing. The 3 higher levels within Zoh also absorb, because they're coming from a level of moichin, so they're receiving. Essentially, moichin gives it the bittul, so to speak, the discipline or the seasoning. When you talk about a newborn child, it's completely reflexive, and the emotions are completely dominant. And it's all about the child's needs. The child is nursing. Whereas in middays, once middays become developed, the moichin are guiding them to some extent, depending the level of maturity. That guiding is coming because the moichin receives from something greater than it. There's an element of bittul. You can't expect bittul from a newborn, because a newborn does not yet have any type of discipline except what they're naturally and impulsively and reflexively and behaviorally capable of doing. As the mind grows and the emotions grow, as we learned, that's where you get a little more, you're able to absorb something greater than you are, but there's also hashpah. Malchus, on the other hand, is only absorbing and is not being mashpia at all. Va'adrabah, let's now continue on learning inside. Va'adrabah, he says. The line begins after the parentheses, like 12 lines from the bottom of the page, 1359. You can find these pages at ayinbeis.com. It says, Va'adrabah, hativda lemivla, the preoccupation to absorb. But we're talking now about Malchus, the Nekudas HaMalchus of the Nekudah of Malchus. Hu b'bchinas aliyah v'iskalus. Not only is it not in the state of hashpah, not only is it not exuding, on the contrary, it's actually going the other direction. It's reaching upward. It's elevating and being encompassed in its source. So when it comes to a mashpia, even though, like you said, like by Zohar, there is an also element that it's receiving, but it's also an element of transmitting. Here, not only is it not transmitting, it's completely going, elevating and being encompassed in its source. And now he's going to connect it to what we learned before in the Zohar. Remember, I am dark, but I'm beautiful. What is the darkness? The darkness is the concealment of Malchus. So he said, this is also what it says in Zohar, that I am dark, which means a state of darkness. Bechin is a level of darkness, which means the opposite of light. Light transmits, shines, it illuminates. Here's Bechinas Shachrus, and Bechinas Hedra, the absence, the lack of light. Bechinas Istalkus Lamaila. Why is it a lack of light? Because it's not shining outwards, it's going upward. And as it goes upward, it doesn't shine out, and therefore it's in a state of darkness, like we learned earlier. Now remember, when he first started, if you go back to a few pages, when he spoke about the Nakuda, he said, what is this Nakuda? When we say a point of Malchus, that it emanated originally in its root, B'shedish, B'seid Shedish, as a Nakuda. So he said, he called it the Nakuda of, let me read it inside, he called it, HaKeser Shabbat. It's the Keser within Malchus. Now, what is Keser? He didn't explain it earlier. He just said it's the Keser within Malchus. He said it once, he said it twice, as later again. Let me just look. Rooted in Ratzon. So he's now going to explain what's the connection to Keser. So Keser, we know in the language of Chassidus, is the level of Ratzon. So he says like this: V'zeu shenekudi b'chinas Keser shebemalchus, shu b'chinas Ratzon. That's the level of Ratzon. Now we know that the 10 spheres are all specific faculties. Chachma is wisdom, conceiving of an idea. Bina is understanding, and so on. Chesed is love. Keser is the general Ratzon, which we usually refer to as a makif, the ability to want something. If you don't have Ratzon, all the faculties will not function. A person could have all the faculties intact, but if they don't want to do something, nothing's going to happen. On the other hand, Ratzon without the faculties is just a general desire. So you need a combination of both. So Keser is called a Ratzon. All the way in the beginning of Ayin Beis, Keser is a theme throughout Ayin Beis, because it's like the interface. But all the way in the beginning, he said Ratzon is the first step that God had to want existence. Same thing with a human being. If I don't want to be sitting here and giving this class, I won't give the class. If I don't want a home, So Ratzon is always the first step, is tainug behind the Ratzon, which is atik. But generally, Keser is a level of Ratzon. I want something. So they explain that the will of God in each world, the Keser of Atzilus is the will for Atzilus. Keser of Bria is the will for Bria. Keser of Chochmah is the will for Chochmah. So every level has a Keser within it. Here he's explaining that the Nekud of Malchus is the level of Ratzon. So the question is, what does that mean exactly? So he says, this is the level of Ratzon, Kenoida. And what is the Ratzon? A will for what? So he says, Va'ratzon ubchinas istalkus v'skalus lidvek b'maitzil tomid. The Ratzon of every one of the spheres, and here we're talking about Malchus, that is the Nekuda, is a desire, to read again, which is from the word, Ratzon comes from the word merutza, as he's going to say in the parentheses. Merutza means a drive. Ratzon means a drive. A drive toward what? So it's the Ratzon, which is a drive toward elevating histalkus, to be encompassed and absorbed and attached to the maitzil, to its source always. That's the Ratzon of Keser that is inside Malchus. So in other words, what we said before, that he's busy absorbing and therefore can't be exuding, it's not just because he's busy doing that. It's because that's the fundamental bittul that Malchus has, like he said all the way on top. That it's completely absorbed with receiving its source. So in other words, the root for why Malchus is so different than all the spheres, Malchus encompasses something that all the other spheres don't have. The utter bittul, a complete selflessness and suspension of anything of its own. I wouldn't even call it suspension, because at this point it was created that way, it was emanated that way. But essentially it's an entity of all the spheres. It's the one that captures most the concept of bittul. Now you could argue, one second, doesn't Chochmah, we learned that Chochmah is bittul. Chochmah, he says in Chochmah is koyach ma. That's why it's only a spark, a nekuda. And Chochmah receives from Keser. Chochmah in its purest form is completely receptive to what's higher than the higher. So even though he doesn't discuss this right here, Rab Shlomo pointed out to me yesterday that there's a maimer from the Rebbe, which is actually taken from other maimorim from the Rebbe Rashab, Tafresh Pei, and others that explain that the Nekud of Chochmah is different than the Nekud of Malchus. Because Chochmah is still intelligence. In Malchus, you don't talk about any type of substance altogether. It's true. Chochmah is an intelligence that's not there to be intelligent, but to experience a reality greater than itself. But you can't say that it doesn't have any tzir at all. You have to say it's Chochmah. So Chochmah ultimately is going to become something we call the beginning of an idea. So the state of being of Chochmah is utterly bittul. That's why he says in Tanya Perek Lamed Hey, chapter 35 in the Hagah, he says, Shemaiti Memoiri, the Alter Rebbe writes, I heard from my teacher, the Maggid, that Chochmah is the level of Hu Levade Ve'ein Zu Loseh. Chochmah senses there's nothing but God. You may recall we discussed this at length earlier in Ayin Beis, that Chochmah teaches, that Chassidus teaches us that wisdom is actually God's tool, gift to us, to be able to experience a reality that's higher than our own subjectivity. Just imagine that a person did not have any independent, objective intelligence. If we would just be emotional creatures, like animals, they also have intelligence, but their intelligence is all focused around their survival, their emotions. An animal uses intelligence to hunt, to protect its young, to breed. It doesn't have an independent intelligence. You're not going to find an animal sitting and contemplating on God and saying, I'm going to fast on Yom Kippur. An animal doesn't have that capacity. We were blessed with a mind, an independent mind, that allows us to transcend our subjective emotional needs. Like I said, not a newborn child, not even a young child, but as we grow, that's what we were blessed with a mind. The mind can tell the emotions, like he explains very clearly in chapter 9 in Tanya. The emotions are impulsive. They say eat, drink, indulge in a temptation, whatever temptation seduces you. And the mind, because the animal soul resides in the left side of the heart, and emotions are impulsive. And the divine soul resides in the mind and the right side of the heart, and it's reflective. And the mind says, no, is this the right thing to do? Is this what God wants you to do? Is it healthy? Don't just grab that piece of food. Maybe it's toxic, maybe it's poison. So the mind has the capacity to go beyond and transcend emotional subjectivity, which really means it allows us to experience a reality greater than ourselves. That's why Meichen is so important. On the other hand, the whole purpose of life is to express it in our emotions. So the mind does have bittul. That's what he said before, that I did the Torah Lemivlis and the Gimel Rishenis, because that's what the mind is all about. It's about not following your desires, but experiencing something transcendent that's greater than you are. Chachma epitomizes that, but it's still with a form of intellect. Malchus, on the other hand, is the other extreme. It's the nekuda that doesn't have any gili. Less lo megamo klum. You don't say a chachma, it doesn't have anything of its own. It's true. It's a state of bittul, but it is chachma at the end of the day. And it's helping us experience a higher reality. Malchus is on the other end of the spectrum. There, it's like the simple child. Chachma is not a simple child. Chachma is intelligence that recognizes something greater than we are. A child naturally doesn't have any giluyim, like the moon. So there, the bittul is complete bittul. There's no hashpah altogether. Chachma is a mashpia. Initially, Chachma receives from Keser, but then Chachma teaches Bina. And Chachma is the beginning of a process of integrating that transcendent reality into our intellect and then into our emotions. Whereas Malchus is just a state of complete bittul, like he says here, and it's the complete bittul of Ratzon. What is it? The Ratzon, to be, like he says, Merutza, to read again, Masha b'malchus hu b'chinas Ratzon ha'Ratzon b'chinas istalkus v'iskalus lidveik b'maitzil tamid. So Chachma also has an element of it, but it's not quite the way it is in Malchus. The Ratzon hu loshem merutza. Merutza means, like we say, something is rushing quickly, or merutza can also be a drive. Merutza, vuharitza. That's like running towards something. So it's a rushing. It's a drive. Oy b'bchinas hamshacha, oy b'bchinas halah. So Ratzon can go both ways. It can be a Ratzon to something that you're going to draw down to something, or it's a Ratzon b'chinas halah, elevation, which he's talking about here. Imratz lipcha, that when your heart will rush, your heart will be imratz lipcha le'echad is the expression. It will be, your heart will be drawn and rush. So that's where you see the word ratz from the word running, rushing.
That's a Russian.
Yes. Yeah. He spoke about it also earlier in volume 2 and a few other places. Yeah. So I would say in this context that the difference between the bittul of, let's say, Chochmah, or the bittul even of other levels, in contrast to Malchus, is like the difference between a bittul of a Rebbe or of a very wise person than the bittul of a child. When the Baal Shem Tov says that a ish pashut, the pshittus of a ish pashut, the simplicity and innocence of a simple person or of a child reaches pshittus ha'atzmus, that's not Chochmah. That's like the example. And I'll explain it. That's the example that the Baal Shem Tov gives on when he explains the pasuk where it says Tfilah la'ani, and the lashon is L'fnei Hashem ashpei. Yeah. So he explains what's the ani. Why does it say Tfilah la'ani? And then Lifnei Hashem Yishpech Sichi. Sichi or Sichi? Sichi. So he explains with an example. Why ani? Why like a pauper? So he said 2 people were invited to see a king. One was a literate, educated Talmid Chacham, a scholar. The other was an ani, a pauper. Ani meducha, complete, impoverished, illiterate, doesn't have any giluim. First comes the chacham. He never saw such a palace before. So he's completely enamored and enthralled by all the beauty of the palace. He appreciates it all. He appreciates the precious stones, the marble walls, the library, the music, everything about the palace. And he gets so enamored, so mesmerized by it, he misses his appointment with the king. Got distracted by the king's glory, by the king's majesty. Then comes the pauper. The pauper doesn't appreciate any of this because he's illiterate. So he walks through all those fancy and exquisite chambers and walks right into the inner chamber of the king and has his appointment and asks for everything he wants to ask for. Says the Baal Shem Tov that when you stand before the Melech, suspend all your literacy and all your qualities and all your appreciation, because you'll be very distracted. The world is a very big world. The stars have beauty in them. Science has beauty in it. Suspend it all, because if not, you can get distracted and end up looking at God's handiwork, at God's art, and forget to meet the artist. Whereas the Ani doesn't have that issue. Then he can ask God for everything. So it's the difference between Etzem and Giluyim. The Ani goes straight to the Etzem because he does not distracted by all the fireworks. The Chacham was distracted. Now, this is not advocating illiteracy. The Chacham has to learn that we're not telling you to stop being a Chacham. Just don't suspend your Chachma when you're standing before the king. So that's the bittul of Chachma. The bittul of a Ish Pasha doesn't have Chachma in the first place. So the truth is you want both. You want the bittul of someone that has all the Giluyim and they don't get distracted by it and reach the Etzem, but Malchus has it naturally. That's what it was created to be. The emanation of Malchus is a Nakuda. It never has Giluyim in the first place. The Giluyim are only going to be added to it as an add-on, as we have learned and will learn. But on its own, less l'magamo klum. It's complete bittul, like the child, like he said, like he compared it to a nursing child, or to learning something where you can't yet be mashpia at all. The chacham is a mashpia. He also has to have bittul, as we're learning here. So just to add a little more explanation to what we're learning. So what is the nekuda of Malchus? It's the Keser within Malchus. That's the Ratzon. And what did he explain Ratzon is? Ratzon is only one thing: a passion, a drive to connect to the source. Now he does say in the parentheses it could be a hamshacha, but clearly here we can't be talking hamshacha because he's saying it's the opposite. It's aliyah v'iskalulus. So listen, when a person has you could have a very strong passionate desire for something outside of yourself. That's a Ratzon of hamshacha. But here he's talking about a Ratzon of halah, that's to elevate and be consumed in the source. And that's why this also explains why it's a nekuda. It's not just a Ratzon, it's a nekuda. Because a nekuda represents something that doesn't have any expansion and any transmission. A nekuda is a pure, concentrated dot. Al-Kain adarabah. And that's why, on the contrary, not only is it not being mispashad and extending and transmitting, it's in a state of constant elevation upward. So Malchus is in a full state of total submission and total surrender, total bittul to that which is above it, in the fullest sense of the word. Ukamoshela eish, like the example of a fire. She'im ein lo psilo, if a fire would not have a wick, what would happen to the fire? Lias nechaz lamata, if it didn't have a wick that grounded it and held it down, harihu il lamayla. What would happen to the fire? It would expire. The fire would disappear. It would just go upward. It's the wick that contains it and keeps it grounded and keeps it burning below. If not, you see, even with a wick, the fire is always reaching upward. Now that's begashmis. Beruchnius, it means that the neshama, Ner Hashem, Nishmas Adam, as he explains in Tanya, chapter 19. he says that the neshama by nature is like a fire. Its nature is to go upward. It's the body and the command that Hashem says, I want you to stay below, that causes the neshama to be grounded. But on its own, it naturally gravitates to its source. The opposite of gravitates. Instead of going gravitates below, it is drawn to its source. That's what he's saying. That's the Eish, that's the Nekuda. And similarly, the Nekuda of Malchus, being that it does not have containers in which Malchus is contained by. I know he said before it's Eir and Keli. We'll get to that in a moment. But let's just say it doesn't have Kelim. That's why Malchus is in a state of Aliyah and Istalkus. Its natural state is to go upward and be encompassed in its source. Now, the fact that we know that, like he said in the bottom of the previous page, that Malchus was Netzal, Eir, and Keli, you have to say he means here that there is a Keli, but the Keli is so negligible that it's not in any way limiting or containing the Eir. So essentially, Malchus is much more in a state of bitl than it is of being grounded. Now, we need to explain this because till now we've been learning that Oyer actually is the mashpia and Keli is the makabel. So if Malchus is anything, it's a Keli, not an Oyer. And here he's seemingly saying that Malchus is Oyer, whose nature is to go upward like fire. So that I need to give a little thought how to explain this. I mean, my initial response would be to that yes, indeed, Malchus is a Keli makabel, but it's a makabel that's an entire being is permeated with receiving what it has to receive. So what he means by Kelim, you can speak, Kelim can mean two things. A Keli means grounding something and drawing it downward, or Keli could be completely the Keli, like we spoke about Pnimius Keli, that's all it is to absorb that which is higher than itself. I think that's the distinction here. So Malchus is the Keli that's just absorbing something greater than itself, not the Keli, like the Kelim of Zoh, for example, are also to draw it downward. It's not just to contain it. That's how I would explain it. Though he doesn't distinguish, maybe he will qualify it, but that right away jumps out at you because till now we've been learning, that's what we've been learning, that Malchus is Be'ikar Keli, which means Makabel. And the Oyer is Mashpia, is the sun, is Oyer. And the Levana is more of a Keli. But I think that's what he means here. The Oyer HaLevana, the Oyer of Malchus, the Nekudas HaMalchus is an Oyer that's in a form of receiving and reaching that which is higher than itself. Whereas the Oyers of Zoh are Mashpia downward. Here, it's all elevating upwards. That's how I would probably explain it.
Yeah,
needs more elaboration. Needs more elaboration, but in concept, there's no contradiction. We just need to find the right words and language to explain it properly. What did you say?
No, I said that he's saying it on the first line of this page.
Right. But I'm just saying here he's suddenly saying that she'ein lo b'chinas kelim. So I think the diuk is in lias nechas behem lamata. In other words, Malchus is not about kelim drawing it down. It's really about the teichen is clear. I'm just looking for the language because we're not going to say suddenly that Zoh is kelim and Malchus is Oyer. The difference is Eir Makabel and Eir Mashpia. And Eir Makabel is much more about the Aliyah V'Istalkus, and the Kelim there are not about drawing them down. Anyway, it's two aspects in the Keli, what I would say. Fine. Any questions?
Yeah, the fact that we say that what is it? Magarme
klum. Yeah.
In Malchus, so that and then it's only a keli. I mean, it's not an or. It's a keli that only has Keser in it. The only or that's apparent or begiloy would be Keser in Malchus. The rest is a keli. So how are we saying that it's now an or that wants a nostalgic and only go up. It's truly
that's what I just explained.
I know.
That's what I asked, and I answered that question.
Yes, but I didn't understand your answer.
Well, I explained there's two different things in a keli. There's keli that contains and draws down. Like, for example, you take a cup has two roles. It receives and contains the wine in the cup. And then the second role of the cup is for you to drink from it or pour it to someone. So when it contains, it's in the form of aliyah and istalkus, because it's just receiving that which is higher than it. When you're pouring it to someone or drinking, that's when it's in a level of hashpah and like hamshach. So he's saying Malchus is only the first aspect of that. That's so he means it's not the keli that's nechaz that contains it to draw downward. It's a keli that's only there to receive that which is higher than itself. So he doesn't compare it to oir, he compares it to eish, actually, to fire. Meaning the nukud of Keser in it is the Ratzon to connect to its source. That's what Malchus is. I was just trying to reconcile with what he said earlier, that Malchus is primarily not oir, but keli. So I'm saying, so my answer is, it's the keli as keli of a makabel, which is like an oir makabel. That's what the keli here is, like an oir makabel, an oir that is to receive, not to be mashpia. Whereas Zoh is an oir mashpia. And therefore the kelim there are also in order to help draw it down, not the opposite way. As I said, it may need more language, but that's the content for sure, something like that.
Like chassan and kala, the word, chassan go down, kala and to be a mashpia, and kala rises up, kala, it's implicit, and that Malchus eventually, and in the Yemei Mashiach is going to be at a much higher level, and we know from Yehuda and Yosef, a similar type of thing. Yehuda raised up higher than Yosef, and that was Malchus.
And I love that.
Okay.
Rabbi Jacobson, when I say Leis La Megarme Klum, it does have those other Zah and the Gimel Rishonim in Malchus, right? There still are those aspects. They're just in an immature or totally.
No. In Malchus, they're add-ons. He called that the Seid Tosfos. It's not what Malchus naturally emanates as just one point. And then things are added onto it, so to speak. And that would be Zah and Moichin ultimately, and so on. In Zah, it's in the level of katnus. That's what he said.
So just to be clear on that, because it's a totally I didn't understand it properly. You're saying that when Malchus, God created Malchus of Atzilus, in its in primordial state, there's just Keser inside. There's no other Sphirot.
The language of let's read inside. This is from the Arizal. He says Malchus Netzola. I'm reading inside. Beseit Sheish Shtak Nekuda Achas V'hu HaKeser Shabbat V'Atesfiris Boim Ba Beseit Tosfos. I'm reading 10 lines from the bottom of page 1357. That's exact quote from the Arizal. So that's correct. The last statement you made. So they come, but they're add-on. That's like an add-on. It's not Malchus in its root, Seit Sherish, what it is in its inherent state. Zah, on the other hand, emanated as 6 facets, Chesed through Yesod. And Moichin emanated with all 10 spheres within it. It's all explained in Biri Azer, Mitler Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek, but he quotes that here on page 1357. That's the outset before everything we're learning is explaining that.
But obviously, he said before, Zois Vadai Shenekudas Hamalchus Yesh Bo Oil. So it's not only kalim, it's a different kind of oil, not the test spheres.
This is the whole piece that we just learned. What kind of oil is it? Let's say the chatzma. Yeah. We haven't finished. The topic is not over. He's still going to be a little more a few more subtleties, a few more steps that we need to figure out here.
Did you just say that the Zah also is a sim in that it only has the 6 midos in it when it's primordial?
I referred you where to read. It says it all inside here. We learned it inside.
So that's the Gimel Rishonim is also an add-on there. So that's okay.
What he's,
Okay. I didn't. I always thought
go back to page 1357. He states that very explicitly.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
So the statement that I've always learned that every sphera has another is kolel, all the sphirot. That there's Chachma in Malchus and there's a Chachma in Chesed and the Gimel Rishonim in Chesed, Malchus in Chesed. That is all that is in its primordial state is not exactly an accurate statement. It's only accurate.
About which level? Zah, Malchus.
Say Zah.
Zah, the primordial state has 6 facets in it. Chesed, Sheba Chesed, Gvura Sheba Chesed.
Okay.
Anyway, you need to go back.
I'm
repeating already 3-4 times. He said this is not my statement. It's explicit here. Everything we're learning is based on this. He actually gave actual sources. He said, "Movish she'arim shar beis chelik beis perek aleph beis." He brought Pri Eitz Chaim. He brought Shar Kavonis. This is all discussed explicitly on page 1357 and the top of 1358. I strongly suggest you read that again, because that's the whole basis of everything we're learning here.
In the Rebbe's Maimer, Tovshin Gimel, that we spoke yesterday, he said...
Just remember one thing, I just want to say. The things you may have learned in Chassidus elsewhere, remember you didn't learn Kisva Arizal inside, right? So you don't know the Arizal. The fact that Chassidus quotes certain things, that doesn't mean you have the whole picture. You're just getting a piece of it. When you start learning more Chassidus, you start seeing there's a lot more complexity to each of these levels. So it's true that the spheres are encompassed within each other. But it's also true there's a certain way that they develop that way. It didn't just happen overnight. Some of it is inherent, some is acquired, etc., etc. It's just like an Avodah. There are things we're born with and the things we acquire. So in the spheres, it also works that way. There are things they're born with, so to speak, inherent to them, and there are things that they acquire either through Avodah, like he said, Lesla Megamo Klum. He says, either it needs the ashpah from Zah to get it, or through Avodah Milmata, through the neshamas. That's what this whole piece began on page 1357. There's 2 ways that Malchus is built. Were you here when I gave the long class on what Binyan HaMalchus is, Aliyas HaMalchus, how all the Avodah we do is around the building of Malchus? I spoke about this at length in a few classes. This is really the basis of everything we're learning, starts from that point. Okay.
I started to say that in the Rebbe's Maimer, he's talking there about the Gimel Rishonos, that they have the entire Eser spheres, Bishleimus. The Zoh is having 6 spheres.
This is straight from Movei She'arim. What the Rebbe says there is the source is this Rizal. Yeah.
And then he said that the Malchus is not the Nekuda of the Keser.
Well, on page 1357, it's all spelled out very explicitly here. Okay.
Can you take one more question, please?
Yeah.
So forgive me. I have been at every class listening, and I'm still pretty confused about some of this stuff. Well, as follows.
That's a good sign. That's a good sign.
You know, I understand you're explaining the nature of Malchus in its inception, in its fundamental state. That being said, Malchus is still an interface between different alomos, particularly in Biad. Everything the Elakusan or travels through the upper spheros is Makabel, and we've emphasized Malchus as a Makabel. It goes into Malchus, and then it becomes essentially above Keser for the next level. And ultimately, Malchus of the Sia is where we are right now, which contains everything. Now, I understand that's not its inherent nature, and so you're talking about its inherent nature. But at the same time, all these things are happening contemporaneously. It's not like Malchus was born with this bittul and is just this nikuda, etc. Maybe that's its fundamental nature, that's its personality, its identity, its essence. But as a practical matter, it's full of everything. And that's why it's a makabel. So it's really hard to distinguish these things if everything's happening essentially at the same time. It's not like Malchus sat there in its fundamental state for eternity or for a long time. All of a sudden it got filled up. So I'm having this difficulty understanding these dissections, these analyses of Malchus, when as a practical matter, it is still filled with light, even though its essential nature may be bittul. And I guess my question is
I understand. I'll give you my immediate answer.
Okay.
Besides the fact that you're processing more than absorbing, which means you're bringing other stuff you've learned, the most important thing is, if you think of surgery, a doctor is going to perform, God forbid, surgery on somebody to heal them. Let's say heart surgery. Even though the body is filled with many, many systems, and frankly, almost between 30 and 75 trillion cells, and there's more than just the heart. Right now, the focus, when you really want to be surgical, you need to focus on what we're addressing, the heart. The fact that there's so much more going on, and that Malchus is part of a whole organism called Biyah and so on, is, like I said, what you're doing is bringing everything you've learned and saying, 1 second, there's a whole picture here. But the Rebbe Rashab and anyone that's an expert says, right now, we're dissecting this piece here. If a doctor would say, I'm so confused because there's so much going on in the body, they won't be able to perform the surgery on the heart. So Chassidus, at its best, looks at each level, at what that level is, and once you understand it, then you can start saying, okay, here's how it interacts with other levels, and so on. So Ayin Beis is a classic example of that. So right now, I would just suggest to you is we're learning what Malchus is from its inception, and let's see how the Rebbe Rashab develops it. Obviously, the Rebbe Rashab wrote a Hemshech, which is now already 1,359 pages. So he obviously knows that there's a bigger picture, and we've talked a lot about different subjects, including Malchus. But now to understand the next section of understanding the theme of Ayin Beis, and especially in the context of Makabel and Mashpia, the point that he wants to make, the difference between Ner Mitzvah and Torah, and the idea that how we transform darkness to light, which is so much central to the theme, the Rebbe Rashab feels it necessary to zero in now on this part of this map. We're zeroing in. Just like when you look at a big map and you zoom in, you enlarge, and we're looking only at Malchus right now as it is in a magnified way, without much discussion of its relationship with anything else. But then will come the next part where he will discuss its relationship. Remember, that's why I said before, the class I gave explaining why all of Avodah is about building up Malchus. All of Avodah, we're talking about Rosh Hashanah coming, Binyan HaMalchus, Aliyas HaMalchus, Miut HaLevana, the diminishment of Malchus, and then it's rebuilding, because Malchus is the place where it all takes place, is the interface. So right now we're focusing on this aspect, which is critical to understand Malchus, what it is in its core place. Look, to use a psychological example, I counsel many people. People come to me for advice. The first thing is to zero in on where the issue is. And you have to zoom in and just talk, let's get to the root of it. Actually, it's interesting, he uses the word seid sherish, the root of it, not its expression, not its expansion, not its interaction with other things. What is the root cause? And when you understand the root, you can then develop it outward. So I understand that you are wanting to understand the whole thing, Malchus, in context with Biyah and Asiyah and above and below. But as I always say, be patient and understand that what the Rebbe Rashab is doing as a real master, he's actually avoiding talking about anything else and just trying to talk about Malchus as it is in its purest form. And then we'll see where that goes. Remember, there's also the Tosfos. He said, B'sei Tosfos, Malchus has 9 spheres in it. He didn't discuss what that is yet. He's been focusing only on the Nekuda of Malchus. He didn't yet discuss. So it's just like we go to a child. At conception, we all begin as one cell. It's important to know that. And then that cell will multiply and split and ultimately develop into a whole organism. That's how I would put it in context.
Yeah. Do you think, okay, one step further, sorry, I'm like a journalist, follow-up question. And I know I shouldn't process, in terms of the Hasidus applied of all this, do you think he's moving toward a point, or one can infer from this that if we understand this essential nature of Malchus this way, then it can essentially help us in our avoida in terms of understanding what the goal should be in order to be able, I don't know, to, well, of course, one thing is to, yeah.
Yeah, if you want Chassidus applied from this, I'll apply it to you right now. What we learn from Malchus itself is the need to just absorb without processing. That's what Malchus is in its purest form. That's the lesson in life. That there's a time.
That's a good one.
Yeah. There's a time where that's all you do. And that's what Malchus is there. I actually gave, I don't know if any of you heard my class I gave last Thursday in the Kollel. You know, I give every week on the Seder Shtalshlus. I'm actually talking about Malchus now. I just finished about Malchus. If you want to know what is the lesson of Malchus in its purest form, is utter bittul. Meaning, let me just listen and absorb to what is being said without anything else going on. That's literally if you want to apply this in personal life. So every sphere has its role. Zah, for example, its role is mashpah. What are you doing to help another, to teach another? You have something in you to teach. Even though Zah also has bittul, like he said, but that's more the bittul in the top of Zah. There's a part of even when you're teaching, you also have to know you are really a recipient. But Malchus is pure recipient at this point. And we're not talking now Malchus and other aspects, this particular point. So you could apply this. I mean, I didn't mean to turn it on you. I just meant to say that's exactly what Malchus teaches us.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's fair. It's touche. It was very good.
No, and like for example, I talk about Chazar. When I was listening to the Rebbe speak, I had to be in a complete state of Malchus. Simple as that. Shut everything off, everything I know, everything I learned, everything I understand. Let me just hear what the Rebbe is saying. To me, it's the closest example to this. I can't say completely Malchus because there is an element of Chachma there. You can't say shut everything down. You are listening and you're hearing words, and there is some, but as close as possible to absorbing without processing.
Got it. Well, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll go a step further. You know, when we say David Melech Yisrael, Chai v'Kayim, or we say Malchus is Der Ashvi, Malchus, the seventh generation. I mean, essentially, you're talking about a state of the Melech being total bottle. That was the real role of a king, was to be a personification of bittul, not of ego. That's why he said David didn't have any years of his own. The other element of real bittul. I mean, there's going to be a lot more. He's going to talk about this at length,
right?
But this is really the personification of bittul in the fullest sense of the word. The thing, however, is bittul in the inherent state of malchus. Look, trust me, I probably have also questions. You should know, but I just know how to just put them aside. We'll see where it goes. I have a lot of questions, but I don't let it bother me because I trust the Rebbe Rashab. He's holding our hand, and I let him lead us. I'm fine with that. You know, we'll see where it goes.
Okay, thank you. That was extremely helpful because my mind's been swirling for 3 or 4 pages.
Good. Are you able to sleep?
Thank God.
All right, Jacobson. Okay. When you said that the Malchus is tachas a bittul, its only reason is to absorb, to absorb. But at the same time, you said it has a yearning to nostalgic and to be cleaving to a higher level, to its source. But isn't that two diametrically opposite tenuas?
Well, listen, cleaving, the Ratzon to cleave can be an active Ratzon. It can be a natural Ratzon. To me, it sounds like it's just like nature of Malchus is to do that. It's not like, for us, it would require a deliberate choice. Right now, I'm going to absorb and not process. It seems to me that Malchus emanates just as a natural absorber. It's just a natural absorber. And how does that spell out? that it's the kuda of Ratzon to just to get connected. But I don't know if this is an active Ratzon or a so-called passive. I don't know, passive is the right word. An active one or an inherent one. It sounds to me like a flame. A flame doesn't need to work on reaching upward. A flame naturally. So this is what it sounds like to me in the way it is in Atzilus. I'm not talking about how it's applied in our Avodah. That's what it sounds like. So this Ratzon would be not so much like, okay, here I am. I'm an entity and I want to connect. I think this is more its natural state is to be a natural absorber. But I would wait and see how this develops to be able to fully explain that properly, because he's still in the middle, and that's the only thing. I don't want to jump to any conclusions. You follow what I said?
I did. I did. It's intrinsic, but even if it's intrinsic, it seems to be two different motions. One is passive. You use the term passive, and one is more not passive. It's an intrinsic, but it's an intrinsic yearning for something higher. And passive.
Well, listen,
no yearning at all. I'm just here, and whatever you say to me, I'm fine. I'm not yearning for anything. I'm just here.
No, but that's not the point. It's not what I said. The natural state of Malchus is to yearn. That's what I said. It doesn't require, it's like the natural ava musuteres of a soul that just wants to connect its source. So it is a desire, but it's a natural desire. It's not meaning it's not superimposed. You don't have to impose it on yourself. It's there. The natural nature of fire is to reach out, like I explained, like I quoted from Tanya, chapter 19. So it's not passive. It's natural and intrinsic desire is to connect. And then there's a desire that comes, it's not my natural thing, but I want it. Here, I believe it's the first, not the second.
I understand it's intrinsic versus
But
not.
It's intrinsic Ratzon. It's intrinsic Ratzon to connect to its source.
So
that's what Malchus is. That's how it was emanated, to be such. Anyway.
Okay.
Remember, Malchus is not the source. Malchus is an entity. The entity is one that doesn't have anything of its own, and its entire being is to be absorbed. Anyway, we'll learn more about it. Let's stop here. The 3 lines from the bottom of page 1359. Another parenthesis is going to explain again the difference between Zohar and Malchus with more detail. And I think there's going to be some more interesting, intricate details as we go here. Yeah.